Good evening, everyone. Tonight's speaker is Colonel Retired John L. Orr. Colonel Orr joined the Royal Canadian Navy in September 1963 and graduated in 1967 from the Royal Military College of Canada. Selected for aircrew duties, he completed 5 operational tours on the Sea King helicopter. Colonel Orr attended the Canadian Forces Command and Staff College and has held a wide variety of command and staff appointments in Canada, NATO, and the Middle East. He retired from the Canadian Armed Forces in September 2000, and since then he has volunteered as a researcher at the Shearwater Aviation Museum, where he has concentrated his efforts on documenting the history of the Canadian Sea King helicopter, the saga of the air station at Shearwater from its establishment as United States Naval Air Station Halifax in 1918 until today, and most recently the Trans-Canada Flight of 1920. Please join me in welcoming John Orr.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Before I begin this evening, may I welcome Susan Smith, a descendant of Robert Leckie, who has joined us tonight from the UK. In a note explaining her connection with the Air Marshal, Susan explained that about 30 years ago, her uncle gave her a small handwritten family tree. Among other branches, it showed a great-grandmother along with her sister Annie, married to a Sam Leckie, and a little arrow labeled with the remark, "To Canada." Below them, their 3 children, including Air Marshal Robert Leckie, her grandfather's cousin. And this triggered Susan's own response, and through the magic of the internet, she contacted us. Thank you very much for joining us, Susan. Now, for a long time, I've been intrigued by the Trans-Canada flight, and not just because of its striking resemblance to a Sea King cross-country, both from the speed of advance of the aircraft and the frequency of unscheduled stops. My true interest stems from the fact that the Trans-Canada flight represents the first critical step in the development of Canadian civil and military aviation in the post-First World War era. As such, it was a singular operational achievement of the Airport of Canada during its brief existence from June of 1919 until December 1922. And of course, it is also an account of a very determined group of aviators. There are 5 parts to my presentation. First, I will briefly describe the events that led to the establishment of the Air Board in June of 1919 and its subordinate formation in the Canadian Air Force in February of 1920. I will then introduce Leckie and the lads and relate their experience prior to the Trans-Canada flight. Next, I will describe the flight itself, showing how this small group of airmen blazed a trail across the country in open cockpit aircraft in October in Canada, just 11.5 years after the Silver Dart rose above the deck. And then I'll come back to Leckie and the lads to examine the impact that they each had on the development of aviation in Canada in the years following the flight. Finally, I'll conclude with some thoughts on Leckie and the lads. A short word about sources is in order. The usual secondary sources were consulted along with Wing Commander Manning's Canadian Geographical Journal article about the flight. Nothing can be achieved in this field without the assistance of the staff at Library and Archives Canada, the Canada Aviation and Space Museum, and the Canadian War Museum, and I thank them for their assistance. The same applies to the Directorate of History and Heritage, and in this regard, I would like to particularly acknowledge the contribution of Matthias Joost to this and many similar projects. The Canadian Aerophilatelic Society and local history museums across the country made a significant contribution to our understanding of the flight and its impact on the various communities along the route where these aviators landed, sometimes in dire straits. Lastly, I would be remiss if I did not recognize the invaluable contribution made to this talk by the Trans-Canada 100 Aerial Research Collective. This small team spread across the country showed amazing ingenuity and determination in digging out little-known facts about Leckie and the lads. Minutes before 8 o'clock on the morning of the 7th of October 1920, the peaceful waters off Air Station Dartmouth were shattered by the sound of a Rolls-Royce Eagle engine as a rather ungainly seaplane taxied from its moorings and headed out into Halifax Harbor to take off on the first leg of the Trans-Canada flight. A flight that is not well known by Canadians, carried out by an even less well-known organization, the Air Board of Canada. The First World War brought in an era of rapid development of military aviation, with the result that virtually all of the combatants established their own air forces. However, despite the fact that substantially more than 20,000 Canadians served in the British flying services, they did so as members of a colonial air force and not as part of a distinctly Canadian formation. The reasons for this are varied, but for most of the war, the government of Canada lacked a consistent aviation policy and was reluctant to become involved in the formation of a Canadian Air Force, chiefly because of its responsibility to provide a 4-division corps in the field. And yet, by the end of the war, Canada had 2 proto-air forces, the Royal Canadian Naval Air Service in Canada and the Canadian Air Force in the UK. 2 operational flying bases in Nova Scotia manned by the United States Navy, while the Royal Canadian Naval Air Service was being trained. A major British flying training organization, RAF Canada, with several air stations in Ontario, a robust aviation industrial base in the form of Canadian Airplanes Limited in Toronto, and a large number of trained aircrew and technical personnel, both in Canada and overseas. While I'd like to relate how these developments came to pass, time is of the essence, and I will concentrate instead on the events that led to the establishment of the Air Board of Canada. Turn back to 1917. Sir Robert Borden was in the UK from February until May, principally to attend a series of meetings of the Imperial War Cabinet and the Imperial War Conference. As Tim Cook reminds us, this was when Sir Robert transitioned from being a wartime Prime Minister to becoming Canada's first warlord. Borden was much impressed by Lord George's Imperial War Cabinet and its supporting secretariat. When he returned to Canada, Borden introduced a new cabinet-level structure by creating 2 super committees. The first was a war committee charged with the responsibility for overseeing the national war effort, and the second was a reconstruction and development committee. It is the latter committee that is of interest to us. Borden specified that, among other tasks, the committee was to be responsible for the investigation of the possibilities of air service for important national purposes. We have an insight into Borden's thinking regarding the future of aviation in his correspondence with Lord Montague of Beaulieu, who was in Canada in December of 1917 on an unofficial visit on behalf of the British Air Board. In a letter to Montague, Borden amplified the general remarks above about aviation by quoting from the Order in Council that established the Reconstruction and Development Committee, as shown here. Borden further indicated that not only was the question of the establishment of a separate Canadian Flying Corps under consideration, but that he supported Montague's proposal that Canadian Airplanes Limited should remain active following the war. However, in the immediate aftermath of the war, demobilization and economy were the watchwords of the day. As an Imperial unit, RAF Canada was quickly closed down, and its principal air station, the air side of Camp Borden, was turned over to the Department of Militia and Defence. The aircraft manufacturing facilities of Canadian Airplanes Limited were quickly disposed of. The Royal Canadian Naval Air Service was disbanded on the 5th of December 1918, and the air stations in Nova Scotia were turned over to the Canadian Navy. In the UK, the future of the 2-squadron Canadian Air Force and its wing headquarters lay in the balance. As we will see, the Ministry of the Overseas Military Forces of Canada sought to return the formation to Canada intact as the nucleus of post-war military air service. This argument failed to carry the day in Ottawa, and the decision was eventually made to disband the Canadian Air Force in the UK in early 1920. Apart from the military aviation developments mentioned above, there were developments in civil aviation as well. In June 1919, a bill was introduced in the Senate to grant the Canadian Pacific Railway Company a charter to provide aviation services, both domestically and internationally. The bill was not enacted, but clearly some people were thinking ahead. All the more reason that regulations for the future of civil aviation needed to be established. As part of the post-war deliberations held by a subcommittee of the Paris Peace Conference, Canada, as a member of the British Empire delegation, was heavily involved in the talks that eventually produced the International Convention on Air Navigation. Canadian representatives included the Honorable A.L. Sifton, Minister of Customs and Inland Revenue, and Lieutenant Colonel O.M. Biggar, the Judge Advocate General of Canada, both of whom, and particularly Biggar, would loom large in the implementation of post-war aviation policy as members of the Air Board. All of the above placed great pressure on the Dominion government to finally do something with respect to the future of aviation in Canada. In this regard, earlier in January 1919, the President of the Privy Council had tasked Major McLaurin, the acting director of the Royal Canadian Naval Air Service, to write a paper regarding the establishment of a national Canadian Air Service. The paper was submitted on the 28th of January 1919, and matters began to move more quickly. There emerged two competing visions of for the future of aviation in Canada. As mentioned previously, the Ministry of the Overseas Military Forces of Canada sought to form a post-war military air force, while the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Naval Service, Mr. J.A. Wilson, along with Major McLaurin, shared a broader vision of the possibilities for aviation in Canada in the post-war era, a future that stressed aviation as an enabler of Dominion government responsibilities, using the readily available supply of trained personnel and equipment. From Wilson's perspective, the time had not yet come for Canada to embark on a policy of maintaining a permanent military or naval air forces. Wilson's vision won out, and an Air Board Act was introduced on the 29th of April, 1919, and given royal assent on the 6th of June. As mentioned, Sifton and Biggar were appointed as the chairman and vice chairman of the Air Board, respectively, on the 23rd of June, 1919. The Air Board was given the broad mandate to supervise all matters connected to aeronautics. To accomplish this, aeronautics was broken down into three distinct fields: the control of commercial flying under a certificates branch, the conduct of flying for the Dominion government under a flying operations branch, and the establishment on the 18th of February 1920 of a non-permanent, non-professional Canadian Air Force reporting to the Air Board and responsible for the air defense of Canada. Finally, in order to comply with the International Convention on Air Navigation, Canada promulgated Air Regulations 1920 as the keystone document regarding civil aviation in Canada. While the Air Board had been dealing with legislative and organizational matters throughout 1919, things had not stood still in the world of aviation. This was the year of flying firsts, mainly inspired by the 10,000-pound Daily Mail Prize for nonstop crossing of the Atlantic. The claim to the title of First Across went to the US Navy and their flight of Navy Curtiss flying boats that staged through Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, the Azores, and Portugal before finally reaching the UK. The Daily Mail Prize and the glory for the first non-stop transatlantic flight went to Alcock and Brown, who crossed the Atlantic from Newfoundland to Ireland on the 14th, 15th of May, 1919. Undoubtedly inspired by the Daily Mail Prize, on the 1st of July, 1919, Senator William Dennis, spurred on by his nephew, Mr. W.H. Dennis, the editor of the Halifax Herald, offered a prize of $5,000 for a trans-Canada flight from Halifax to Victoria to be completed by September 1919. Fortunately, or unfortunately, there were no takers. Moving on to April 1920, the Honorable Hugh Guthrie was appointed as chairman of the Air Board, replacing A.L. Sifton following his retirement from the post. Initially, the Air Board was opposed to a transcontinental flight. As late as the Canadian Air Force Association meeting in Winnipeg in July of 1920, Lieutenant Colonel Biggar summarily dismissed any suggestion that Canada undertake a trans-Canada flight. And then things changed. The reason why is not clear, but in an account of the flight by Robert Leckie, he indicates that the new chairman of the Air Board, Hugh Guthrie, felt that something of a spectacular nature should be done to focus attention on flight, and a flight across Canada seemed to fill the bill. And so the Air Board approved the Trans-Canada flight and the planning began. The Air Board objectives for the flight were as shown here. The responsibility for this pioneering effort was to be divided between the three branches of the Air Board as indicated here. There were, of course, a myriad of other details to be taken care of, including arranging for letters of greeting from mayors and lieutenants governor to be sent to Air Station Dartmouth and then hand carried to the mayor of Vancouver and the lieutenant governor of British Columbia. No aircraft, no air force can exist without aircraft, and how the Air Board ended up with an assortment of war surplus equipment is worthy of a presentation of its own, something you may have already done. Suffice it to say that after the war, the UK Air Ministry offered to donate to Canada, along with other dominions, a collection of aircraft, balloons, and airships with which to launch their own air force. This was the imperial gift and was intended for military as opposed to civilian purposes. This did not sit well with the Canadian Air Board, and they were determined to exchange land planes for seaplanes and flying boats. The debate raged late into 1919 when J.A. Wilson visited the UK on behalf of the Air Board to review the selection of aircraft with the Air Ministry, without much success. The aircraft that took part in the Trans-Canada flight are listed here. In order to compete in the transatlantic race of 1919, a single-engine Ferry 3C seaplane had been given a brute force modification to extend its range by the addition of extra fuel tanks in front of the pilot, which naturally restricted forward visibility. It was postulated that with the extra fuel, the aircraft would have a range of 2,000 miles, enough to permit a direct flight from Halifax to Winnipeg. However, according to Leckie, the modified aircraft had never been tested prior to arrival at the Canadian Vickers Dry Dock in Montreal for assembly. The single-engine Curtiss HS-2L was a standard USN flying boat of the First World War. When the Americans left the air stations in Nova Scotia in 1919, 12 HS-2Ls and 26 Liberty engines were donated to the Canadian government. The Felix Stowe F3 was part of the imperial gift and was a twin-engine flying boat built in the UK. The DH-9As, also part of the gift, were single-engine land planes. Following their arrival at Camp Borden, 4 of these aircraft were shipped west to be erected for the Trans-Canada flight and to be flown in relays to the West Coast. We are fortunate that Stan Michalak, an expert modeler from Winnipeg, has prepared a beautiful 1/32nd scale model of the DH-9A, which flew from Winnipeg to Regina. Just to show you how realistic this is, check the Hudson Bay Company blanket in the cargo compartment. We will now take a look at the background of Leckie and the lads. Their signatures appear on the envelope of this letter addressed to the Mayor of Vancouver from the Mayor of Halifax, and it is held by the City of Vancouver Archives. Please note that there is no postage stamp on the envelope, so this was not the first Trans-Canada airmail flight. I will introduce each of the pilots using their Royal Aero Club data card where possible. Otherwise, I will use a photograph of the day. First up is George Johnson. He was born in 1896 in Woodstock, Ontario, and moved west where he became a school teacher. He was initially accepted in Canada for service with the Royal Naval Air Service, but on arrival in the UK in April 1917, he was transferred to the RFC. Following training, he flew the SE-5A in both numbers 84 and 24 squadrons and had 11 victories. He was decorated with the Military Cross and the Croix de Guerre. He was transferred to number 1 Squadron Canadian Air Force in November 1918 as a flight commander and is shown here on the right of Major McKeever, the commanding officer. In July 1919, Johnson was assigned to supervise the crating up of war trophy aircraft in the UK for shipment to Canada. He then proceeded to Camp Borden, was placed in charge of ungrading both the war trophy and the Imperial Gift aircraft. He joined the Air Board on the 1st of June 1920, and for the Trans-Canada flight was assigned as the navigator for the Ottawa to Winnipeg leg. Basil Hobbs was born in 1895 in Berkshire, England. His family moved to Canada in 1900, and he grew up in Sault Ste. Marie. He pursued training as an electrician through apprenticeships in the Sioux and Cleveland, Ohio. As indicated here, he attended the Wright School in Dayton, Ohio, and was appointed as a temporary probationary flight sub-lieutenant in December 1915. Once overseas, he qualified in flying boats and served at Royal Naval Air Station Felixstowe. Basil had a good war and was decorated with the Distinguished Service Order for shooting down Zeppelin L-43 and was twice awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for attacks on German submarines. After release from the Royal Air Force in June of 1919, he joined Supermarine Aviation Works, and in September 1919, flew a Supermarine Sea Lion in the first post-war Schneider Trophy race. In 1920, Hobbs returned to Canada and joined the Air Board in Ottawa. He was then selected to be the co-pilot with Robert Leckie for the Halifax to Winnipeg leg of the Trans-Canada flight. Geoffrey Home Hay was born in 1888 in Scotland. Following school, he apprenticed as a steam fitter and emigrated to Canada in 1908 and farmed near Wadena, Saskatchewan. He enlisted as a private soldier with the 32nd Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in Winnipeg in December 1914, and in November 1915 was commissioned in the 7th Battalion, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. He eventually transferred to the RFC in May of 1916, and by 1917 was in France with 53 Squadron engaged in artillery spotting, for which he was decorated with the Military Cross. In May 1918, he was posted to number 104 Squadron, part of the Independent Air Force. He led several bombing raids over Germany with great determination, for which he received the Distinguished Flying Cross. He returned to Canada in June 1919 and resumed farming in Saskatchewan. When it was announced that the Canadian Air Force would attempt the Trans-Canada flight, he proceeded to Camp Borden, and upon qualification was assigned to fly the Winnipeg to Moose Jaw leg of the flight. Billy Cudmore is one of the members of the lads who has not left much of a trail. He was born in the UK in Derby in 1897. At the outbreak of the war, he joined the King's Shropshire Light Infantry, and in June 1915 transferred to the Royal Flying Corps and served in numbers 40, 29, and 64 squadrons as a fighter pilot and had 15 victories. We see him here in September 1917 when he was with number 29 Squadron in Belgium. For his wartime service, he was decorated with the Military Cross and the Distinguished Flying Cross. How Cudmore ended up in Canada following the war is a bit of a mystery. Apparently, his father was involved in the manufacture of prefabricated housing to address the shortfall in British housing stock following the war, and Cudmore Sr. had large timber holdings in British Columbia. It is possible that this family connection brought Billy to the West Coast. As in the case of Home Hay, when the call went out for pilots for the Trans-Canada flight, Cudmore stepped forward. Upon recertification, he was chosen as the pilot for the flight from Moose Jaw to Calgary. Tommy Thompson was born in India in 1894 to a distinguished military family and attended Bedford School in England. In 1912, he emigrated to Canada to study at the Ontario Agricultural College in Guelph, Ontario, where he pursued a Bachelor of Science degree. When war broke out, he was on his way to England by September 1914 and joined the Royal Sussex Regiment. We see him here on the left in a 1915 photo taken in the trenches in France. In December 1915, Thompson transferred to the Royal Flying Corps, and upon receiving his wings, flew in numbers 16, 37, and 18 squadrons. Early in 1918, Thompson was posted to RFC Canada as a flight commander in number 2 Squadron at Camp Borden. On demobilization in 1919, Thompson, along with Pat Cuff, co-founded the British Canadian Aircraft Syndicate, later the Canadian Aircraft Company in Winnipeg. This company closed in August of 1920, and Thompson then joined the Canadian Air Force for the Trans-Canada flight. Thompson was chosen to fly through the mountains from Calgary to Vancouver, perhaps the most challenging stretch of the whole Trans-Canada flight. Arthur Tiley was born in Lennoxville, Quebec in 1887. His family moved to Boston in 1898, where he eventually attended MIT, graduating in 1907 as an electrical engineer. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Canadian Militia in 1915, attended the Curtis School, and received his Royal Aero Club certificate in the UK in January of 1916. He eventually became a flying instructor in the UK in late 1916 and was posted back to Canada for duty with RFC Canada, where he held a variety of appointments, including command of the Camp Borden and Deseronto wings. In early 1919, Tylee assumed command of Royal Air Force Canada during its rundown phase. For his wartime service, he was awarded an OBE. Tylee was released in May 1919 and then appointed as the Air Officer commanding Canadian Air Force on the 17th of May 1920, an appointment he held until March 1921. In this capacity, Tylee not only had to engage in the bureaucratic battles over the future of the Canadian Air Force in Ottawa, but also had the challenge of keeping everyone pointing in the same direction. No mean feat in an outfit that had many personalities, but not much of a corporate identity. Not one to shirk his duty, Tylee volunteered to be the passenger from Winnipeg to Esquimalt. Robert Leckie was born in Glasgow in 1890. After schooling in Scotland, he came to Canada to work in his uncle's firm, John Leckie Limited in Toronto. In June of 1915, Leckie enrolled in the Curtis Flying School, but was unable to complete his certification in Canada when the school closed for the winter. He was sent on to the UK and eventually qualified for his Royal Aero Club certificate in May of 16. Selected for flying boats, he was appointed to Royal Naval Air Station Great Yarmouth. Leckie, along with Hobbs, had a good war. On the 14th of May 1917, Leckie received the Distinguished Service Cross for shooting down Zeppelin L-22. On the 20th of February 1918, Leckie attacked a surface German U-boat, which appeared to sink, and he was decorated with the Distinguished Service Order. Leckie's most famous action came on the 5th of August 1918, when he jumped in a DH-4 to intercept Zeppelin L-70. Leckie was in the gunner's position and brought the Zeppelin down. Both Leckie and the pilot were awarded Distinguished Flying Crosses. Leckie was soon promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel and appointed to command number 228 Squadron at Great Yarmouth. He then joined the Overseas Military Forces of Canada and was appointed as the officer commanding number 1 wing of the 2 Squadron Canadian Air Force at Shoreham. He was later granted a commission in the Royal Air Force while in command of number 1 wing. Following the closure of the Canadian Air Force overseas, the Royal Air Force loaned Leckie to Canada for 3 years so that he could take up duties with the Air Board as the superintendent of flying operations. Leckie was to be the pilot for the leg from Halifax to Winnipeg. Having met the players, here is the enormity of their mission. As mentioned previously, great reliance was placed on the Ferry 3C to fly directly from Halifax to Winnipeg. Regrettably, this reliance was misplaced. When Leckie and Hobbs went to Montreal on the 22nd of September to carry out a test flight, it became apparent that the aircraft could not take off with sufficient fuel for a non-stop flight. So the route was adjusted and additional refueling stops added. After several frustrating delays, Leckie and Hobbs finally left Montreal with a ferry on the 29th of September, bound for Halifax. Due to a series of misadventures, the aircraft was stranded in the St. John River west of Fredericton, and it was not until the afternoon of the 5th of October that the ferry landed at Air Station Dartmouth, having finally reached the start line. At 8 o'clock on the 7th of October, the ferry departed Halifax with a bag of letters from across the country for delivery in Vancouver and headed for a scheduled refueling stop at Rivière-du-Loup. Alas, the problem-plagued ferry ran into turbulent weather over the Bay of Fundy, and shortly after passing St. John, part of the starboard engine cowling ripped off and struck an externally mounted fuel pump, dousing Leckie in fuel. Then a similar piece of the port engine cowling flew off and struck the tailplane, causing the fabric of the fuselage to peel off like streamers. A forced landing was carried out on the long reach of the St. John River, and the ferry was so badly damaged it could not complete the rest of the flight. Leckie called up an HS-2L from Dartmouth, and it flew through the turbulence over the Bay of Fundy to rescue Leckie and Hobbs. The crews hurriedly exchanged aircraft, and Leckie and Hobbs flew on to Fredericton in the HS-2L. They refueled at Fredericton and at 1915 headed off to Rivière-du-Loup and landed in heavy weather at 23:05. Rather than carry on to Winnipeg that evening, the crew wisely elected to spend the night at Rivière-du-Loup. On the 8th of October, Leckie and HOBBS took off for Ottawa at 7:20 on board a Felixstowe F3, which had been flown in from Montreal the day before to act as a standby. The seas were still running at Rivière-du-Loup and waves were breaking over the top wing when the F3 took off. Accompanying the crew to Winnipeg was foreman mechanic C.W. Heath. After reaching Ottawa at 12:30, engine trouble delayed their departure to Winnipeg until the following day. Captain George Johnson joined the crew in Ottawa and would act as navigator for the rest of the flight to Winnipeg. Following an 8:45 takeoff on the 9th of October, the F3 arrived at the Sioux at 16:35. Refueling was promptly completed, but dense fog precluded a takeoff until the next day. After leaving the Sioux at 7:30 on the 10th of October, Kenora was eventually reached at 15:55 when the F3 landed to refuel and repair a leaking radiator. The F3 finally took off at 20:15 to complete the leg to Winnipeg, where, according to press reports, 5,000 people were awaiting their arrival. The airmen followed the Winnipeg River westward to Lake Winnipeg and then southward along the Red River to a planned landing near the confluence of the Red and the Assiniboine rivers. Heavy mist precluded a landing, so they proceeded north along the Red River to land at Selkirk at 22:45. Disaster was narrowly avoided moments before touchdown when HOBBS jinked around an unmarked dredge moored in the river. The bag of letters was immediately sent on to St. Charles Airfield in Winnipeg by car, where Air Commodore Tylee and his pilot, Captain Home Hay, had been waiting for Leckie to arrive. Takeoff was at 4:30 on the 11th of October, and Home Hay and Tylee headed west with Moose Jaw as their intended destination. Unfortunately, the DH-9A developed engine trouble just past Regina, and Home Hay turned back to land at Regina's municipal airport. Cudmore was summoned from Moose Jaw, and by 11 o'clock, he and Tylee were in the air on their way to Medicine Hat, where they arrived at 13:45. They were joined there by Flight Lieutenant Thompson, and the two aircraft took off together at 15:10, heading to Bowness Field in Calgary, where they arrived at 17:10. Here are the happy but undoubtedly tired aviators on their arrival in Calgary. The leg from Calgary to Vancouver presented significant challenges, both from the altitude of the mountain passes and the poor weather experienced in October. On the 12th of October, Thompson and Tylee were weathered in at Calgary. On the 13th, they eventually got away at 11:55 and headed into the Rockies following the Bow River and crossed into BC via the Kicking Horse Pass. They then crossed the Selkirks using Rogers Pass and headed west of Revelstoke, only to be turned back by heavy snowstorms. They eventually landed at 15:10 at Crowell's Lake outside Revelstoke, Crowell's Ranch outside Revelstoke. 14th of October was another weather day. However, Air Commodore Tylee and the aircraft proved to be immensely popular with the local children seen here hiding under the wing. It was not until 15 October that the flight could continue. Takeoff was at 11:50, and after crossing the Monashees via Eagle Pass, they were forced back by fog and landed at Merritt at 13:15. Only the Coquihalla Pass over the Cascade Range now laid between them and Vancouver. Another attempt to cross the Cascades was made on the 16th of October, but the airmen returned back yet again. Finally, on the 17th of October, following a 7:30 takeoff, the weather in the Coquihalla Pass opened sufficiently to allow the aircraft to slip into the Fraser Valley. At 11:25, they touched down at the Memorial Park racetrack in Richmond. The Flyers were greeted by Mayor Gale of Vancouver, as well as the rest of the Trans-Canada team who had gone on ahead to Vancouver by rail. The letters carefully carried across the country were presented to the mayor on the following day. But this is not the end of the story. While at a celebratory dinner in Vancouver on the 19th of October, the Flyers were urged to continue their flight to Esquimalt by Mr. Norman Yarrow, general manager of Yarrow's shipyard in Esquimalt, and perhaps more importantly, the vice president of the British Columbia Advisory Air Council for the Air Board. Willing to comply with Mr. Yarrow's request, Leckie and Tylee pressed Major McLaurin, now the air station superintendent at Jericho Beach, to lend them a Curtiss HS-2L so they could fly on to Esquimalt and truly complete their Trans-Canada flight. On the 20th of October, Leckie and Tylee, accompanied by Hobbs and Thompson, took off from Vancouver for Esquimalt. They became lost in murky weather over the Salish Sea, and after trying to establish their bearings, they eventually spent the night in Friday Harbor in the American San Juan Islands. Fortunately, the crew were able to complete their mission on the 21st of October, and after lunch with Mr. Yarrow, they called on the Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia to deliver letters from the Lieutenant Governors of Nova Scotia, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. Leckie summarized the final part of the Trans-Canada flight as a comedy of errors, and Hobbs is quoted as saying, rather disingenuously, that the flight got lost because the charts furnished the flyers were not quite correct. And so the Trans-Canada flight ended. It had demonstrated that transcontinental flying in Canada could be undertaken. However, the Air Board summary report emphasized that better ground organization would be required to support routine Trans-Canada flights. Specifically, a network of well-marked airfields would have to be built. Aircraft would require a means of communication with the ground, and low-frequency radio ranges would be necessary for navigation. It was also acknowledged that adverse weather would continue to be a deterrent to long-distance flying, and therefore accurate weather forecasts would be indispensable. Let's now look at what the future held for our intrepid aviators. By the time of the establishment of the Royal Canadian Air Force on the 1st of April, 1924, Johnson had been promoted to squadron leader and was serving in Air Force headquarters. There followed a dizzying series of appointments. In March 25, he was in command of RCAF Station Winnipeg. In January 1929, he was promoted to wing commander and appointed to RCAF headquarters, and while there, was designated as the acting senior air officer of the RCAF for 6 months. This was followed by command of RCAF Station Trenton, and in January 1936, Johnson attended the Imperial Defence College in London. He was then promoted to group captain, and in April 38, was in command of Western Air Command in Vancouver. In November 1939, Johnson was promoted to Air Commodore and placed in charge of overseeing the Canadian responsibilities for the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. In July of 42, he was promoted to Air Vice Marshal and appointed as Air Officer Commanding of No. 1 Training Command in Toronto. This was followed by command of Eastern Air Command from January of 43 until March of 1945 at the height of the Battle of the Atlantic. He was then promoted to Air Marshal and appointed as Air Officer Commanding in Chief, RCAF Overseas in London. He returned to Canada in March of 46 and retired in 1947. Following the war, he was appointed as a companion of the Order of the Bath. After the Trans-Canada flight, Basil Hobbs was posted to Air Station Jericho Beach in Vancouver. He was soon on the move and was appointed as superintendent of the Air Board Air Station at Victoria Beach, Manitoba in 1921. When a permanent headquarters for all airborne activities in Manitoba was established in Winnipeg in 1922, Hobbs was placed in charge. Of note, the current headquarters building at 17 Wing, Winnipeg, is named in his honor. Hobbs carried out the first long-range aerial photographic survey undertaken in Canada in 1924. The route covered the Reindeer Lake, South Churchill River area, and Hobbs, the sole pilot, completed the mission in 1 month, covering nearly 3,000 miles. We see him here, second from the left, in this famous photo of his Vickers Viking aircraft. In 1925, Hobbs retired from the RCAF and established a wine and spirits importing business in Montreal, which is still in operation. In 1940, Hobbs rejoined the RCAF and was appointed to RCAF Station Dartmouth on the 27th of July. There is, unfortunately, no record of Hobbs wistfully looking out over Halifax Harbor on the 7th of October, 1940, 2 decades after his takeoff from Airborne Air Station Dartmouth, but there should be. Hobbs was promoted to wing commander in March of 41 and group captain in March of 42. In March of 1944, Hobbs was appointed to command RCAF station Patricia Bay, British Columbia. In May of 45, he retired from the RCAF and was awarded an OBE for his wartime service. Following the Trans-Canada flight, Home Hay returned to farming in Saskatchewan. He resumed flying in 1928 as a bush pilot and flew with a number of small outfits in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, including Arrow Air, where he was chief pilot. He was a corporate pilot with Sherritt Gordon Mines and then went to Canadian Pacific Airlines as superintendent of Northern Manitoba operations at Flin Flon, Manitoba. When he finally retired from active flying in 1952, he had amassed a grand total of more than 16,000 hours. True to his status as a man of mystery, we have not been able to discover much about Cudmore following the Trans-Canada flight. In the fall of 1920, he and his new Canadian bride left Victoria for England. It appears that in the 1930s, Cudmore was an instructor at flying clubs in Yorkshire and Nottingham. He joined the Royal Air Force Reserve between the wars and was a flying instructor with the RAF in the Second World War. Following the flight, Thompson was promoted to squadron leader and stayed in the Canadian Air Force as an instructor until 1921. He then re-entered the world of bush flying. Thompson quickly established a reputation as an efficient operations manager and moved into positions of increasing responsibility with Laurentide Air Service and the Ontario Provincial Air Service. In 1928, he co-founded Patricia Airways with Doc Oakes to service the Red Lake area of Ontario. In 1929, Thompson joined James Richardson's Western Canada Airways and was appointed as superintendent of operations at the PA, where this photo was taken in 1930. He then became superintendent of Western Canada Airways Prairie Air Mail Service based in Winnipeg. In 1935, Thompson became the general manager of Western Canada Airways, and when the firm was absorbed by Canadian Pacific Airlines in 1942, Thompson moved to Vancouver and became general manager of CPA's wartime aircraft overhaul plant in New Westminster. He then became CPA's superintendent of operations for BC. In 1948, he joined the Federal Department of Transport, where he became the district controller of air services for BC. Following the Trans-Canada flight, Air Commodore Ty Lee continued as the air officer commanding of the fledgling Canadian Air Force. We see him here in the blue serge uniform of the CAF, the democratic and economical uniform that he espoused, not at all like the uniform of the Royal Air Force, which the RCAF eventually adopted. Ty Lee retired from the Canadian Air Force in March of 21 and returned to Boston. In 1940, he once again answered the call to the colors and joined the Department of Munitions and Supply to head the aircraft production branch, where he served until 1945. Following the Trans-Canada flight, Leckie plunged back into supervising the flying operations branch, but difficult times lay ahead. The general election of December 1921 brought in a Liberal government headed by Mackenzie King, and moves were soon afoot to combine the Departments of Militia and Defense, the Naval Service, and the Airborne into one department, the Department of National Defense. To add insult to injury, the airborne function was placed under the Chief of Staff of the new department. This change came into effect on the 1st of January 1923, but by then, two of the stalwarts of the Air Board, the Vice Chairman, O.M. Biggar, and Robert Leckie, had departed the fix. Leckie returned to the UK in May of 1922, and his staff appointments reflected his interest in training. Operationally, he remained involved with maritime aviation and commanded Royal Air Force units in the carriers Hermes and Courageous. In 1935, he was appointed as the Director of Training of the Royal Air Force, and then in 1938, as an Air Commodore, he became Air Officer Commanding Mediterranean, based in Malta. Leckie was once again loaned by the RAF to Canada in August of 1940 to assist in the establishment of the British Commonwealth Air Training Plant. Promoted to Air Vice Marshal in 1942, Leckie transferred to the RCAF in 1943. He was appointed as Chief of the Air Staff of the RCAF on the 1st of January 44 and served in that position until the 1st of September 1947 as an Air Marshal. We see him here in the photo taken just prior to becoming Chief of the Air Staff. It is no accident that the aircraft model in his hands is not a fighter or a bomber, but a cancel flying boat, symbolic of the RCAF's important role in the Battle of the Atlantic and Leckie's roots as a flying boat skipper. For his wartime service, Leckie was appointed as a companion of the Order of the Bath. These 7 men of different backgrounds came together in 1920 to meet a significant challenge, to plan and execute a trans-Canada flight where none had gone before. The adversity that they faced along the way would have stopped lesser men, but they persevered and achieved their goal, which was, in Hugh Guthrie's words, to do something of a spectacular nature to focus attention on flight. And after the trans-Canada flight, they continued their involvement in different branches of aviation. In summarizing what motivated these men and others of their generation who took to the skies, Tommy Thompson put it this way. This concludes my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.